Now, I got to tell you, when I started praying with this scripture a week or so ago, it just hit me. I wonder if this is the scripture that was the inspiration behind the Beatles song, right? I don't care too much for money. Money can't buy me love. Isn't that just a great direct connect? But look, let's get serious. You ever wonder why does Jesus and the Pharisees always seem to butt heads? You ever think about that? I mean, today they're complaining, hey, you went to stay at a house of a sinner, right? And when Jesus healed the blind man, they had a conniption, right? Let me ask you, was that a loving act to heal that blind man? Yes or no? Yeah. And you know, when he healed the woman who was stooped over for years, was that a loving act? Yeah, but they didn't like that either. And the man with the withered hand, right? He healed him. Was that a loving act? Yeah. And they complained about that too. And they complained when he and his disciples were walking through some fields, picked a few grains of heads of grain. Why? Because every one of those loving acts occurred on a Sabbath and was against the law. Against the law. What happened there, right? I think what happens, and it happens to all of us at different times, the Pharisees and you know, those people, they got confused about the means and the goal, right? They got confused that the law was there in order to help us love God and love neighbor. But they swapped them, and the law became their goal, right? And when that happens, good things don't happen, right? When we confuse the means with the goal, things don't go well. Look, let me give you an example. Money is an important means, right? It's an important means to achieving the goal of living a comfortable life here in Kingwood. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So, you know, we need money for food, for shelter, for rent, all of that stuff. All right. So you go out and you get a job and you start making money and you're living a reasonably comfortable life. Reasonably comfortable life. And then it starts hitting. You know, if I made just a little bit more, I could buy that nice car, right? And you make a little more, you buy the car, and you think, if I made just a little bit more, and before you know it, slowly, and ever so slowly, the goal becomes not living a comfortable life, but accumulating wealth. And it happens so slowly that we don't even notice it. So slowly that we don't notice greed and selfishness and gluttony becoming part of what we do and how we are on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's what happens to us all. See, Zacchaeus bought into this. The money, accumulating wealth, became his goal, right? And he was willing to sacrifice anything to accumulate that wealth, including being with his brothers and sisters, right? And he had lived with it for such a long time, he didn't notice it anymore until he was up in the tree and he heard Jesus say, Zacchaeus, come on down, because today I'm staying at your house, right? The Pharisees had that problem where they keep looking to the law above all else and losing track that this is how we get there. It's not the goal. It's not the goal. And I think when they did that, they were willing to sacrifice anything. including loving the sinner Zacchaeus, including loving the blind man, including loving the woman who was bent over, including loving the man who was withered. They were willing to give up all of that because the law had become its goal, their goal. Sometimes I think when we get the means and the goal confused, especially around the articles of faith, sometimes I think we get more focused on accumulating God's grace, accumulating God's love, than giving it away. And if we don't give away God's love, it turns into something else. The Pharisees had lost all of that. And they became more worried about their own personal holiness or whatever than loving their neighbor. Remember when Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan? He tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. The priest and the Levite both crossed to the other side of the street. Why? Because they didn't want to violate the law around ritual purity. And so they were willing to let this guy die alongside the road. Brothers and sisters, we all fall into that trap ourselves. But what we need to do is remember the goal is to love God and love neighbor. And it's not about accumulating love, accumulating grace. It's not about personal holiness. We are all called to love God and love our neighbor, and that's always about loving the other, willing the good of the other, being focused on the other, not ourselves. So these Pharisees were willing to, they didn't even notice it anymore, right? And because they didn't notice it anymore, they just kept driving harder and harder, their mantra, follow the law, follow the law, follow the law. And what kind of impact was that having on Zacchaeus for all those years? Wasn't very effective, was it? But look what Jesus did. Jesus does what he always does. What he always did was he stayed laser focused on letting his Father's love flow him to all of us. And he was willing to let that love flow through him to the Zacchaeus, the tax collector, to who was not following the law, who was a sinner, who did all of these wrong things, but it didn't bother Jesus at all. Because he knew our goal should always be to allow the love flow through us to others. And look what happened. What happened? On the surface, it looked like Jesus was ignoring the law, right? That he wasn't in sync with the law. But look what Zacchaeus did. You notice? Zacchaeus started following the law. He started following the law when he experienced the goal of the law, love. And that's what we're called to do. We're called to allow God's love to flow through us. So that at the end of every day, at the end of our life, we can step back and say, I gave away every bit of God's love that he gave me to my brothers and sisters. I think it might be a good idea to take a minute or two tonight, maybe every night, to ask ourselves, how well did I do in giving away God's love? Or was I more concerned about gathering it up for me? And then ask yourself, we need to ask ourselves, what do I do tomorrow to share God's love with every person I come in contact with, sinner or saint or tax collector?